Take a second to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your support means everything here. The air tasted of old pennies and mold, thick and heavy, the kind of damp that did not just settle on clothes, but burrowed into the bone marrow. Chris hit the ground, moving right as the sun promised to show its face, though that promise was still drowning in a sea of moss-colored mist. The dawn here was not a burst of light. It was a slow, sickening dilution of the blackness. His rucksack was a familiar beast, 40 pounds of highly specialized gear, pressing down on his shoulders with the intimate ache only professional necessity provides. Every step was deliberate, a conversation with the ground. He moved across a carpet of ancient, decaying fir needles, testing the give beneath the soles of his boots. The moisture here was structural, part of the atmosphere itself, a dense, wet oppression that coated the inside of his nose. He felt the cold seep through the protective membrane of the footwear, climbing his ankles like thin, icy wire. This was the fringe of the zone, the soft, rotting edge of what had once been a protected tract of timberland, now designated the exclusion. Around the 2.5-mile mark, the unnaturalness started to bite deep. The forest was not merely quiet, it was muted, sound dampened, as if a heavy switch had been flicked and the world's peripheral noise turned off. There was none of the usual morning complaint of wind scraping against pine bark, no frantic scramble of unseen small mammals in the undergrowth, and definitely no bird chatter, the high, insistent background noise that always accompanied a summer sunrise. This silence was a vacuum, an absence so profound it strained the inner ear, making Chris's own pulse sound like a hydraulic pump failing under pressure. It forced his mind to frantically search for the expected stimuli, a frustrating echo chamber of nothing. He adjusted the set of his jaw, acknowledging the pressure. In this line of work, the lack of sound was a louder warning than any scream. He moved toward a minor ridgeline, the ascent slow and requiring the kind of focus that burned energy fast. At the crest, where the rising sun finally managed to punch a few ragged shafts of pale gold through the thick canopy, he found the first visual evidence. On the trunk of a massive, wind-blasted Douglas fir, there were vertical scoring marks. Chris halted, his breath held tight in his chest. He knew they were fresh. The resin still wept faintly at the edges of the wounds. These were not the casual claw marks of a territorial bear. They were deep, irregular gouges, starting abruptly at a height he measured at 8 feet. They did not curve or trail off. They were etched with brutal downward force. This was not marking territory. This was stress testing the material, the tree trunk being used as a sharpening post by something far heavier and more purposeful than any native predator. He ran a gloved hand parallel to the lowest mark, his mind cataloging the radius of the claw necessary to produce such a score. Nothing in the local taxonomy matched the profile. He recognized the shape of the damage. It was exactly what he expected. He shifted his pack, the straps groaning softly, and found a suitable perch on a moss-covered granite outcropping, overlooking a heavily overgrown, boggy creek bed below. He saw nothing. The visual field offered nothing but shadows and the shifting, sickly green of the wetland. Still, he felt the atmosphere shift. The air, which had been still and heavy, suddenly had a subtle reverse vector. An object below the line of sight, located within the muddy thicket, had displaced the air mass through movement. It was a pressure wave, faint but definite. Chris slid his hand toward the holster. He retracted the long antenna of his passive sensor equipment and let the electronic hum die down. He put away the small, high-powered flashlight he had been using intermittently. He simply waited. He became a fixture, a statue carved from tactical nylon and muscle. The seconds stretched into minutes, taut and screamingly empty. The forest responded only with that sticky, motionless gloom. The lack of response was itself a confirmation. Whatever was down there knew he was watching. The wait extended until the sun crested fully, flooding the ridgeline with weak light, and still, nothing moved. The pressure dissolved, but Chris knew the object had not left. It had merely reconfigured itself into a waiting pattern. He ate a cold, compressed nutrient bar, chewing slowly, making the process last, allowing his body to reset its clock. He moved onward, now fully alert to the three-dimensional battlefield. The first night in the zone descended like a heavy wool blanket, swallowing the last vestiges of twilight by 7:30 post-meridium. He did not construct a formal camp. He found a hollow beneath the roots of a fallen monarch pine, a perfect natural depression shielded from above and on two sides by dense undergrowth. He pulled a compact thermal blanket just over his head and shoulders, relying on his training to control his core temperature. Sleep was a necessity for operational continuity, yet a luxury he could not afford. He allowed himself to sink into a shallow, fitful doze, his senses remaining on hair-trigger alert. At 1 a.m., the sound erupted. It did not come from his immediate vicinity, but from deep within a ravine, maybe a half-mile distant. It was not the ragged howl of a wild animal, nor the snap of a breaking branch. It was a profound, wet thud, a heavy, dull concussion. The noise indicated something extremely dense and wet. Weighing nearly 600 pounds, striking the earth with brutal, hydrostatic force. It was not a cry of pain. It was simply relocation. The sheer mass implied by the sound suggested movement with intent, the deep, rhythmic pacing of something that knew exactly where it was going and why. The ground beneath Chris vibrated faintly, a low, subsonic tremor that lasted 2 seconds before being swallowed by the impenetrable quiet. He lay there, rigid, listening to the echoes dissolve into the suffocating humidity. That sound indicated a movement of logistics, a patrol shifting, and it was coming closer. Chris tightened his grip on the smooth, cold handle of the long utility knife tucked beside his thigh. He spent the remainder of the short night analyzing the signature of the sound, preparing himself for the cold reality that he was no longer an observer. He was now logged as an intruder. Chris utilized an old logging trail, little more than a suggestion of a path that looped around massive, rotting stumps and wound between fallen trunks covered in thick chartreuse moss. He was not relying on maps anymore. He was relying on feel. His fingers occasionally brushed the earth, skimming the top layer of soil, assessing density and temperature. Forest soil should be spongy, fragrant with the smell of rich, composted leaves and pine resin. Here, it was different. Beneath a thin, dry layer of needles, the earth was cold, impossibly dense clay, packed tight. It felt worked over. Not naturally compressed by time, but recently, heavily disturbed. As if tons of material had been deliberately shifted, and then the surface was lightly replaced to give the illusion of untouched ground. The ground itself wore a costume. Then came the scent. It hit him like a physical blow, choking the air in his lungs. This was not the smell of natural decomposition. The the sulfurous tang of deep swamp gas or dead flesh. This was industrial. It was the sharp, penetrating odor of overheated wet steel, like stepping into a boiler room in an abandoned factory. But underneath that mechanical note was something far more organic and corrosive. It was a blend of spoiled meat left in scorching sunlight, saturated not in decay, but in a harsh, acrid chemical, akin to concentrated ammonia. This was the signature. He recognized it instantly from the limited intelligence packet he had memorized. The glandular defense mechanism, the internal temperature regulation systems, the biological necessity of the constructs. The smell did not belong in the green, quiet woods. It was a violation, the chemical signature of the nest. It did not just linger in the air. It attacked the mucous membranes, causing a nasty, immediate tickle in the back of his throat, forcing him to breathe shallower. He pulled up the collar of his suit, trying to filter the worst of the particulates, but the smell clung to the humidity itself. The trail led him to a small clearing, a pocket of manufactured chaos. Young deciduous trees, mostly birch and sapling maples, had been violently bent but not snapped. They were angled and interwoven in unnatural geometries, forming a dense living lattice about 10 feet high. It was deliberate structural engineering, a haphazard, thorny palisade. The effect was dizzying. Chris recognized the deception. It was designed to force the observer's eye upward, to look for a clean break in the brush, while the true path, a low, wide, muddy trough, snaked unseen at root level. It was an optical lie, primitive but effective. He crouched low, ignoring the vertical chaos, and slipped beneath the canopy of bent wood. The ground here was even wetter, churned by heavy passage. He slowed his breathing, consciously emptying his mind of human expectation. Human logic was a liability now. He had to think in terms of biological efficiency and raw defense mechanisms. The chill of the soil beneath his fingertips felt alien, yet oddly grounding. Chris forced a deliberate neurological shift. He relaxed the superficial musculature, letting his shoulders slump slightly, allowing his movement to become less rigid, more fluid, conserving energy. His body temperature, usually maintained rigorously by the suit, dropped a couple of degrees Fahrenheit, a subtle internal preparation. His vision narrowed slightly, focusing less on the comforting range of greens and browns, and more intensely on movement, contrast, and shadow depth. Every fallen log, every cluster of granite boulders, was instantly catalogued as either potential cover or a high-velocity obstruction. He was fine-tuning the predator instinct that lay just beneath the surface of his military discipline. He rounded a cluster of thick, old-growth spruce, their lower branches creating a nearly impenetrable veil of shadow. That is where he saw it. It was a silhouette, absolutely motionless, positioned near a granite chimney that rose maybe 50 feet above the forest floor. It was tall, too tall for a timber wolf, far too slender and unnaturally articulated for a black bear. It stood upright, its limbs slightly elongated, bent at impossible angles that spoke to phenomenal ligament strength. It was a construct. It was not hiding. It made no attempt at concealment. It was simply there, stretched out, silent, absolutely frozen in a posture of watchful readiness. It was not breathing, or if it was, the movements were undetectable even to Chris's heightened state. It was not blinking. Its stillness was an assertion of dominance, a test. It stood, waiting, evaluating. It needed to know how Chris, the intruder, would react to direct, uncompromised visual contact. Chris did none of those things. He maintained his stride. He did not speed up, slow down, or veer away. He kept his head forward, acknowledging the threat in the periphery, but refusing to engage it directly. He continued his path, recognizing but intentionally ignoring the watcher. He moved with the steady, quiet confidence of something that had the right to be there. The seconds it took to pass, the creature felt like hours. A terrible stretch of time where the pressure of its unblinking assessment was almost unbearable. He felt the chemical odor intensify as he drew parallel, that smell of wet metal and ammonia, now coupled with a faint, low vibration that emanated from its chest cavity. The construct remained rigid, a dark sculpture of muscle and bone against the muted light. As Chris passed, he allowed himself a fraction of a second to confirm the data point. This one was lean, a scout, an early-stage warrior. Its silence was deliberate, its posture aggressive. It was the tripwire, the sentry left to report the methodology of the threat. Chris continued onward, the knot of dread settling deeper in his stomach. He had not destroyed the creature on sight. That was the point. By ignoring the first contact, he had shown that his priorities were fixed elsewhere, confusing the observer. He knew with absolute certainty that the silent watcher was now in motion, but not in pursuit. It was moving to report, and soon the game would shift from observation to coordinated pressure. The construct did not pursue. It shadowed. Chris felt its presence constantly, a heavy apparition, keeping pace through the thick underbrush, always maintaining a precise, infuriating distance. The creature moved parallel to Chris's trajectory, staying just on the ragged edge of visibility, utilizing the sparse cover with unnerving efficiency. This was not a chase. It was a calculated campaign of psychological pressure designed to force Chris to accelerate, to check his periphery repeatedly, and ultimately to make a critical navigational error. Chris, however, had chosen his trajectory for a reason. He was moving toward a specific choke point, a narrow gap between two colossal granite boulders, both covered in centuries of emerald green moss. He knew the construct, operating on the instinct to maintain visual contact and control the flank, would eventually be forced into a path that suited Chris's plans. He was setting up the board. He was not relying on technology now. The specialized gear was reserved for the deep nest. For this immediate threat, he used physics and environmental geometry. He knew the creature would choose speed and directness over caution when the moment of truth came. He reached the gap, slowed his pace almost imperceptibly, and then, with a silent burst of coiled energy, he spun, dropping low behind the nearest boulder. The construct, reacting to the sudden loss of visual contact, accelerated predictably, charging the void where Chris had been only a moment before. The attack occurred precisely at solar noon, though the density of the forest ceiling meant the light was weak and diffused, doing little to illuminate the combat zone. Chris reacted to pure movement and sound. The construct was terrifyingly fast, its movements governed by pure, efficient leverage, limbs acting as rigid, powerful pistons. Chris did not aim for the center mass, the heart, or the head. Those were reinforced targets. He targeted the system. As the creature launched itself into the gap, Chris drove his shoulder hard into the mossy granite for stability and struck low with the utility knife. A short, brutal upward arc aimed at the creature's knee joint. The creature roared, a sound more mechanical than animal, a grating explosion of compressed air and wet fury. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds, a compressed lifetime of violence and calculated trauma. Chris absorbed one glancing blow, a swipe that tore through the layered fabric of his sleeve, leaving a painful, burning sting. But the creature's focus on the attack vector left it momentarily vulnerable. Chris shifted his weight, driving his transformed elbow into the junction of the neck and shoulder, using the rock face as an anvil. There was a sickening shift of bone and cartilage, and the pursuit weapon crumpled, neutralized, ending its path instantly. Chris stood over the vanquished creature, his chest heaving, the air thick with the fresh, pungent smell of its ammonia-based fluids mixing with the damp earth. He did not allow himself the luxury of immediate relief. His first action was observation, a brutal, detached analysis of the trophy. The body was disturbing. Unlike a typical large predator, the bones were disproportionately thick, almost rubbery, cartilage woven with hardened calcium. The skin was dense and rigid, saturated with that metallic, glandular secretion. The eyes were the most unsettling feature. Large, utterly black globes, entirely lacking the reflective quality of a retina or a visible pupil. They were designed not for color or shape recognition, but for maximizing the collection of minimal light, effective in perpetual shadow. Crucially, as he quickly scanned the creature's tough, leathery hide, he noted the absence of scar tissue. This was a fresh construct, a young hunter, dispatched solely for the purpose of field observation. It lacked the defensive scarring that implied long-term survival in this harsh environment. Chris knelt, retrieving his knife and wiping the corrosive fluid onto a large, damp leaf. He paused, his gaze sweeping the nearby rocky outcrops and the high crowns of the pines. A cold realization, sharp and undeniable, settled in his gut. He had made a critical strategic error. He had destroyed the observer too easily, too cleanly. That meant only one thing. Somewhere within a close radius, concealed within the denser cover, there had been a second observer, a backup. The silent watcher had been merely a tool. The second observer had not just witnessed the elimination of its partner. It had cataloged Chris's precise method, his speed, his reaction time, and his targeting priorities. It knew about the composite alloy knife. It knew the weakness Chris exploited. A deep shudder ran through Chris, unrelated to the damp cold. Up until this moment, he had been the hunter, moving on the periphery of their awareness. With the loss of the first construct, that calculus changed violently. His action had not been a successful deterrent. It had been an open book. From this point forward, the operational mandate shifted from simple infiltration and observation to active strategic engagement. The hunters now understood the nature of their prey: swift, resourceful, and capable of brutal efficiency. The silent creature knew how Chris fought. The casual territorial hunting was over. What began now was a focused, strategic pursuit, targeting Chris's known weaknesses and strengths. He was no longer simply hunting the nest. He was the focus of the nest's attention. The constructs would utilize this new data immediately. Chris buried the creature swiftly and silently under a cairn of heavy, flat stones. He moved out, the heavy pressure returning, amplified tenfold. He was being studied, targeted, and actively pursued. On the second day following the confrontation, Chris became intimately familiar with the pattern of pursuit. The creatures demonstrated coordination far beyond the capabilities of terrestrial pack hunters. He found their tracks first. They moved in perfect, rigid alignment, one creature stepping precisely into the footprint of the one before it. The tracks were deep, heavily packed, suggesting significant mass and powerful leg structure. But then, every 100 yards or so, the tracks simply ceased. They did not fade into the stream or dissipate in the thick mud. They just stopped, as if the entire patrol had simultaneously lifted off the ground and dissolved into the air. Chris knew they were not taking flight. They were changing the mode of movement, transitioning from standard locomotion to rapid, low-altitude leaping, utilizing the uneven, rocky terrain to minimize ground contact and obscure their path. They were leaving markers for themselves, a breadcrumb system only they could interpret. The psychological warfare began subtly. They were not attacking, but they were sending messages. Chris stumbled upon a small, gruesome collection of organic material in a dry gully. It was a section of large mammal, not fully consumed but freshly dismembered. The pieces retained a faint warmth, confirming they had been deposited minutes before. It was not a cache of food. It looked deliberately offered or simply discarded. The message was clear. They were not hungry. They were not desperate. They were satiated, resourceful, and had unlimited time. They wanted Chris to know that his presence was an inconvenience, not a necessity for their survival. The dread generated by this calculated cruelty was far more potent than any direct attack. He was moving in an environment controlled by entities that could afford to be wasteful. As dusk bled the color out of the woods, Chris heard the first genuine acoustic trap. It was the sound of a runner, heavy, fast, rhythmic pounding on the mossy, slightly yielding ground. It sounded like a massive, two-legged creature moving at high velocity, heading directly toward a copse of beech trees to his northwest. Chris immediately dropped into a defensive posture, preparing for interception. Then, the pounding ceased abruptly, swallowed by a small, shallow depression in the earth. 1 second of silence, and the next second, the exact same auditory signature, the heavy, rushing gait, erupted from the southeast, coming from a totally different angle, having bypassed the entire intervening quarter-mile of dense forest. They were not alone, and they were not engaging. They were synchronizing false routes, running parallel decoy missions designed to make him spin, to wear down his concentration, and to force him to commit to a direction that would expose him to the true threats. Chris recognized the tactic instantly. Flanking maneuvers, designed to make the prey scatter. He refused to move. He held his position, focusing on the center mass of the noise, ignoring the decoys. Later, huddled beneath a massive, overhanging slab of weathered shale, trying to regulate his breathing, he felt it. Not heard, but felt. A strange, intense wave of heat passed through the ground beneath him. It was a migratory wave, transient but powerful. It pulsed, strong enough to slightly warm the surface layer of the earth where he lay pressed against it. A group of constructs, a substantial mass of them, had just passed directly beneath his location, moving through tunnels or shallow natural cavities just yards below the surface. Their bodies radiated an unusual density of thermal energy, a biological furnace operating at phenomenal output. The heat lasted 40 seconds, A prolonged moment of absolute terror where Chris lay completely rigid, confirming his thermal profile was low enough and his camouflage complete enough to escape detection. He felt the intense, chemical smell of their passage, filtered and slightly muffled by the earth above. His muscles began to cramp from the protracted stillness, but he did not twitch, did not shift his weight. He waited until the thermal signature completely dissipated, until his bones felt brittle and cold again, confirming the creatures were long gone. Analyzing the sensory input and the track patterns, Chris began to delineate their operational structure. He identified 3 distinct patterns of activity, each signifying a role in the nest's deployment. 1. The center. A slow, massive presence, always detected deep within the surrounding terrain, never moving fast, but whose trajectory was utterly unwavering. The core leadership, the decision-maker, the largest and hardest to eliminate. 2. The runners. Fast, erratic, characterized by those synchronized disappearing tracks and acoustic traps. These were the field operatives, the flankers, the ones meant to break his will. 3. The silent, the absolute absence of sound or track, detected only by pressure shifts or subtle thermal spikes on high ground. These moved vertically, the sentinels that reported movement and set up the fatal interception points. He was caught in a pressure loop, and to survive, he needed to break the cycle by disrupting the communication between the silent and the runners, driving them apart and forcing the center to react before it was fully prepared. The time for passive infiltration was over. Chris made the decision silently, folding his internal map and slipping it back into the waterproof pouch. He ceased reacting to the auditory deceptions of the runners and ignored the temptation of the false tracks. Every time they pounded the earth in a synchronized ruse, he simply breathed deeper and maintained his current vector. He treated the distraction units as noise. Then, he made a sharp, deliberate turn. He swung due east, moving away from the more navigable ridges and plunging directly into the heart of the deepest, most tangled part of the forest. A dense thicket of old pines and granite slabs where movement was painful and visibility was reduced to only a few feet. Chris deliberately stepped into their living room. He utilized an old technique he had learned in arid territory, adapting it to the sodden woods, finding the blind spot between active patrol lines. He found a massive, ancient hemlock, its base protected by a dense growth of spiked, needled bushes, all covered in thick, gray-green lichen. He applied specialized camouflage netting, meticulously tucking himself beneath the low, drooping boughs. He spent 4 grueling hours in complete stasis. He installed a small, single-use air filter over his mouth and nose, ensuring his exhalation did not carry the scent of human exertion. He did not move a single muscle. He became effectively a lichen-covered stone. During this grueling period of forced paralysis, he felt the perimeter patrols pass. He smelled them, that rancid, wet metal and ammonia odor, so close that the air felt thick with it. He heard the faint tearing of brush as they navigated the terrain, and once, he felt the hot, fetid breath of a passing runner brush the exposed skin of his hand, mere inches away. Remaining utterly still, refusing to even tighten his grip on his weapon, was the hardest discipline he had ever executed. But it worked. The creatures, focused on detecting movement and heat, registered him only as another natural obstruction. When they had passed, the pressure of their presence lifting like a physical weight. Chris rose slowly, his limbs screaming in protest. The runners, now checking their perimeter, were beginning to show signs of confusion. Their tactic of controlling the territory through constant observation had failed. They had not seen him pass, and their internal maps indicated he should be far to the west. Their communication, Chris sensed, was stuttering. Seizing the initiative, Chris moved fast, using their moment of confusion to emerge directly into their rear. He was no longer the hunted fleeing the woods. He was the hunter stalking the hunting party, methodically reversing the direction of control and subtly breaking their lines of communication. His sensory capabilities, sharpened by the adrenaline and the enforced stillness, were now acute. His awareness of his own body became secondary. All that mattered was the whisper of wind against his neck, carrying the scent data. He detected the subtle thermal spike of the silent operative, positioned higher up the slope, expecting the runners to push Chris up into its field of fire. Chris bypassed the slope entirely. He recognized a narrow ravine, a fissure in the earth where a small, icy stream carved its way through slick, heavy clay. The sound of the rushing water, though not loud, was sufficient to mask his careful footsteps. This was the perfect vector for a flanking move. Before entering the noisy concealment of the stream bed, he created a lure. He pulled a discarded, depleted power cell from his pack, an element that reeked faintly of burnt lithium, machine oil, and his own perspiration. He buried it clumsily under a clump of disturbed moss near the base of the slope, leaving a few visible scrape marks nearby. This was designed to introduce doubt. A sudden, strong smell of synthetic materials and concentrated human effort would make them question the prey's nature. It would make the runners and the silent one hesitate, debating the exact location and methodology of the pursuit. Chris slipped into the stream bed. The freezing water instantly numbed his legs, but the sound was his ally. He moved through the narrow canyon, the walls slick and confining, knowing that the constructs would soon descend into the gully, lured by the confusion he had manufactured. He was baiting a trap using their own procedural rigidity. They expected the prey to retreat. He was forcing them to commit to a pursuit line that put him above them, ready for the inevitable violent exchange. Chris reached the point of no return. A severe bottleneck in the clay-lined gully, where the stream turned sharply, creating a small stagnant pool protected by an overhang. The runners and the silent one, deceived by the scent of the discarded power cell and Chris's sudden disappearance, had been drawn into the gully. Their calculation was fatally flawed. They assumed the victim would follow the logical path of escape, not turn and create a killing zone. He waited, pressed into the cool, damp shadow beneath the overhang. He heard the heavy splashing of the runners below, their approach chaotic and frantic as they searched for the vanished scent. Chris struck from the high ground, using the stream bank's unstable geometry to his advantage. He drew the composite alloy plate, a honed razor-sharp piece of nearly weightless material, designed specifically for clean, precise severance. It was a surgical tool adapted for combat. The first construct stumbled into the clear view below him, its focus directed downriver. Chris launched himself slightly, not in a leap, but in a controlled drop, landing silently on the bank. The alloy plate sliced through the junction of the creature's hamstrings and Achilles tendon with shocking efficiency. The construct collapsed instantly, a heavy, silent heap, its locomotion system critically eliminated. The second construct, the silent one, was impossibly quick. It had been traversing the sheer rock face of the gully wall and was already descending. It registered the fall of its partner and reacted with an immediate vertical trajectory toward Chris. The silent one did not use its primary claws. As it closed the distance, it struck with a devastating side sweep of its forearm, a massive muscular impact designed to bludgeon and tear. Chris managed to rotate, but the impact caught his side, a horrible grinding shock that shredded the outer layers of his specialized uniform and ripped into the thick musculature of his flank. The pain did not register immediately. There was only a dull, pulsing surge of heat, a deep, jarring disruption of his equilibrium. Then the hot, wet sensation started, spreading rapidly across his side. Blood, thick, dark, and viscous, was pumping out, mixing immediately with the cold water and the slimy earth. This was not a minor injury. This was a biological event. The scent of his own blood released instantly into the air mixed violently with the gush of adrenaline and the profound biological shock of the injury. This volatile chemical cocktail hit the internal trigger. Chris felt the instantaneous, non-negotiable process begin. It felt like his skeleton was being dipped in liquid nitrogen, while his muscles were simultaneously compressed by a hydraulic press. His musculature tightened past human maximums, becoming rigid, corded cables beneath the skin. The skin itself changed texture, becoming dense, thick, and preternaturally tough, designed to absorb and deflect. The world around him shifted violently in perception. The greens and browns of the gully collapsing into a high-contrast, sharp-edged monochrome. This was the deep, programmed defensive response of a highly modified organism confronting existential failure. His critical systems had been compromised, and the body was overriding the host. He did not feel tired. He felt a sudden, burning clarity. The instinctual need to eliminate the threat became the only governing principle. The silent one, confused by the sudden change in its target's physical response, paused for a critical second. That second was enough. Chris used the momentum of his transformation, his suddenly reinforced body a piston of bone and hardened muscle. He drove the silent one into the sheer rock wall, sacrificing form for pure compressive force. He ended the creature's path with a brutal single-contact maneuver, forcing its head against the unforgiving stone. He stood there, breathing heavily, the wet iron smell of his own blood mingling with the pungent ammonia of the dead constructs. The transformation stabilized, leaving him in a state of hyper-awareness. Enhanced senses, phenomenal strength, but a terrifyingly thin membrane separating tactical focus from raw, feral instinct. He knew what this meant. The fight was won, but the cost was enormous. The intense, highly differentiated scent of his transformed blood was now being carried on the wind, far beyond the narrow confines of the gully. The rest of the nest now knew two things. He was wounded, and more dangerously, he was different. He was not mere prey. He was a threat that evolved under stress. The immediate aftermath of the partial transformation was a battle for cognitive control. Chris's perception was screamingly acute. He heard the minute shift of silt in the stream bed, the faint flutter of a moth's wings 50 feet away, and the subtle, lingering scent of ozone in the air. Yet every tactical decision had to be rooted in his human military training, executed with this terrifyingly enhanced physicality. The danger was not external. It was the raging instinct demanding a purely animal response. He used the wound, the steady, throbbing pulse of hot pain on his flank, as a psychological anchor. The pain was real, immediate, and required human rationalization for treatment. By focusing on the triage, he suppressed the raw, consuming hunger of the instinct. The transformation had gifted him one invaluable tool: hypersensitive thermoreception. He was no longer reliant on outdated thermal optics or searching for footprints in the mud. He sensed residual heat signatures left in the environment. Construct bodies ran hot, and their movements left a profound wake. Chris began tracking the center not by its tracks, but by the thermal profile of its former path. The intense heat they generated lingered, particularly on cold stone or beneath dense layers of earth. He followed this invisible heat plume, which led him away from the valley floor and upward into a labyrinthine zone of ancient broken slate and basalt scree. He quickly grasped that the nest was not static. On a large, flat slab of rock, partially shielded from the drizzle, he found a profound accumulation of biological waste. Discarded sheets of tough, bark-like material, glistening with sticky, dark secretions. Mixed in were what looked like discarded exoskeletal casings, empty, fibrous chambers that resembled pupae shells, but recently shed. This was not just a place where they rested. This was evidence of systematic migration and biological waste management. The nest was a process, not a structure. It was constantly moving, shedding and reforming as the creatures matured and changed roles. Chris began a frantic calculation. If the nest was migratory, it must be moving toward a logical, defensible destination, a place that provided optimal conditions for the next phase of incubation or maturation. Given the creature's reliance on high internal temperature and the sheer thermal output he had experienced, they would seek out the most geothermally active area in the sector. They were moving to a heat source, a natural, deep energy pool to facilitate the rapid biological cycles he had witnessed. He looked at the map, superimposing the known fault lines and thermal vents onto his current trajectory. The path pointed directly toward a remote, structurally fractured basin known for its hot springs and vapor vents, miles away, concealed beneath the canopy. That was the destination. The center was running logistics. The internal monologue became pure vectors, stripped of linguistic complexity. Cold, energy residual. Move fast, avoid high ground, conserve. Destination, heat. His body no longer shivered from the chill. It merely registered the temperature differential as tactical data. The persistent metallic taste of his own body chemistry was constant in his mouth. He moved like an efficient machine, using his newfound agility to navigate the difficult terrain without disturbing the slate. He was moving faster now, driven by the certainty of his hypothesis and the nagging, predatory satisfaction of the transformation. But he maintained the thin thread of human control. He knew the difference between the animal goal, to hunt and consume, and his mission, to find and neutralize the system. He stopped briefly near a stream that ran unnaturally hot, steam curling off the surface even in the damp air. The thermal signature was profound here, a clear sign that the nest had passed recently, lingering to draw on the heat. He pressed his hand into the wet earth near the stream's edge. The soil felt unnaturally hot, almost feverish. This biological footprint was his new compass. He moved away from the water, knowing that the creatures expected him to follow the easiest path. Instead, he started traversing the steep, fractured face of the ridge, moving above the tree line, cutting the distance by moving straight toward the source of the geothermal activity. The pain was still his companion, a steady, low-frequency hum reminding him to maintain focus. The hunter had become something else entirely, capable of tracking the enemy through invisible heat, propelled by a terrible, controlled force. He was closing the gap. Chris descended the final ridgeline, following the increasingly robust thermal wake of the migrating nest. The concentration of the chemical scent was now overwhelming. It was a physical presence, a thick, hot vapor that burned the lining of his throat. It felt like walking into a confined space where wet iron filings were constantly being scraped and heated over ammonia residue. He swallowed convulsively, the taste of metal sharp on his tongue. Here, at the doorstep of the nest, the residual fear had been replaced by a surging, tactical rage, a focused energy that demanded action. He emerged onto a landscape transformed by geologic stress. He was at the edge of a deep, ancient geothermal rift. A thick, oppressive pall of vapor hung over the area, trapping the heat and the intense odor. Beneath the dense canopy of ancient firs, Chris found the entrance. It was a vertical tear in the basalt, a deep, sheer fault line. But the actual portal was low down, shielded by moss-covered debris. It was a rounded, almost polished hole, smoothed by countless passages of wet, heavy bodies over time. No light penetrated the opening, and the air pouring out was dense and scorching. The external defense system was subtle and deeply unsettling. There were no obvious sentries standing guard by the entrance. The constructs had evolved past the simple picket line. Instead, Chris observed the silent patrols utilizing the highest jagged peaks of the basalt chimney stacks above. They were moving in rapid vertical loops, using the sheer rock faces as launching and landing zones, effectively patrolling the airspace above the canopy. They were protecting the overhead. This realization forced Chris onto his belly. He had to move exactly as he had planned, low, slow, and relying entirely on the infinitesimal shadows created by the root systems and fallen, fractured stones. He pressed himself against the unforgiving earth, crawling across the last 30 yards of open scree, using every millimeter of cover. Then came the sound from within the rift, a noise that instantly severed the last frayed thread of his professional detachment. It was a cacophony of small, quick, wet clicks, hundreds of them, sounding like tiny, powerful jaws working in rapid, synchronized motion. It was the sound of young constructs, hatchlings, being fed or feeding themselves in vast numbers. It was efficient, disgusting, and terrifyingly reproductive. This was a factory. The realization injected fresh adrenaline into his already strained system. He could not risk a full-scale battle with the adults if this biological assembly line was allowed to continue churning out the next generation. The priority was the elimination of the nascent threat. Chris began shedding non-essential gear. The heavy pack was secured beneath a root wad. He kept only his specialized combat knife and a single, dense, pre-packaged thermal block of propellant, designed for rapid, oxygen-consuming combustion. His plan was simple and savage. Infiltrate, seal the main chamber's ventilation, and deprive the heart of the nest of breathable air before they could react to the intrusion. He checked the wound on his flank. It was weeping, but the transformed skin had tightened, providing a natural, albeit painful, biological bandage. He focused the last of his human discipline. He needed speed, absolute silence, and a single, perfect strike. He slipped toward the slick, rounded opening, the overwhelming heat pouring out like an open oven door. The air inside was poisonous, heavy, and functionally zero visibility. He adjusted his stance. There was no room for error now. He was crossing the threshold of safety and stepping into the boiling core of the structure. Chris pushed through the polished entrance, the friction scraping against his protective layers. The transition was immediate and brutal. The air inside was hot, viscous, and seemed to lack the basic properties of respiration. The overwhelming chemical odor, metal, ammonia, and something sickly sweet like spoiled honey, was instantly suffocating. He used the heat as his primary sense. In the absolute crushing darkness, the high temperature allowed him to perceive subtle shifts in the air currents and the slight thermal shadows cast by moving bodies. The walls of the fault line were not merely rock. They were coated in a thick, wet slurry of dark, nearly black tar-like substance, a mixture of secretions, shed biological material, and earth. It was sticky and smelled faintly of rot. This was not a natural cave system. It had been engineered. Chris moved through a network of tight, winding tunnels. He confirmed his suspicion. There was a central chamber, the source of the persistent clicking sound, and branching off from it were narrow, vertical shafts, perfect for the single-file movement of the runners. He heard them now, not far above him, their limbs scraping against the rock as they moved toward the epicenter. This was where the center of the operation would be. Chris's mission now was surgical. He methodically neutralized the runners that descended into his operational space. He operated purely on sound and vibration. As a creature descended, he used its momentum against it. He waited until the creature was committed to the vertical drop, then struck laterally, using the hard edge of his transformed forearm to block and redirect. He sent the bodies of the neutralized perimeter guards tumbling into the deeper, jagged chasms below the main tunnel level, minimizing noise and removing any early warning signal. He passed the incubation chambers. These were open, rounded niches carved directly into the wet, dark walls. Inside, there were no recognizable eggs, only immense pulsating masses of tissue, wrapped tightly in fibrous, glistening membranes. They were connected to the chamber walls by thick, pulsating biological umbilicals that pumped the dark slurry from the wall into the developing masses. It was grotesque, highly efficient, and utterly inorganic in appearance. Chris did not hesitate. He used his knife, the composite alloy vibrating slightly with the force, to sever the thick, nutrient-delivering cords with quick surgical strikes. The biological masses convulsed once, weakly, and then slumped, the life source cut off. He moved with brutal efficiency, prioritizing the destruction of the offspring factory. He rounded the final bend and entered the central nexus. The chamber was surprisingly vast, a naturally occurring dome in the basalt. The sound of the clicking young was deafening, magnified by the enclosed space. The light was almost non-existent, but the heat was unbearable, a searing humidity that clung to the air like hot cotton. And then the center appeared. It did not rush. It did not make a sound. It emerged from the absolute blackness of a side passage with an unnerving, almost regal slowness. It was significantly larger than any of the creatures he had fought so far, taller, broader, its musculature looking almost armored beneath the slick, dark hide. This was the structure's anchor, its gravity well. The center was the only thing in the chamber that moved with absolute terrifying silence. It caused no vibrations. It breathed without audible sound. It was the perfected apex of the nest's evolution. Chris leveled the knife, the air between them thick with the chemical stench and the promise of ultimate violence. The final confrontation had begun. The leader, the center, did not engage immediately. It stood 30 feet away, a massive silhouette in the crushing humidity, utterly motionless. It was assessing. Chris held his stance, his weight evenly distributed, the grip on the composite alloy knife tight but not strained. The creature's eyes, the black, light-devouring spheres, tracked every minute detail of Chris's posture. It cataloged the height of his hips, the angle of his knees, the precise way he balanced his torso, the kinetic vocabulary of his combat training. There was no hint of animal rage in his demeanor, only a cold, analytical interest. It was studying the methodology of its destruction. It was copying. The confrontation began not as a charge, but as a rapid, strategic maneuver. The leader forced Chris to move toward the most challenging part of the chamber, a section of the floor that sloped sharply downward, coated in the slick, dark slime of the nest. It used the walls for impossible speed, launching itself off the basalt not for propulsion, but for abrupt, 90-degree shifts in direction, making itself a ghost impossible to pin down. This was a battle of space management, not brute force. Chris quickly realized the terrifying truth. This creature was learning in real time. It was not relying on stored instinct. Every move Chris made, every feint was instantly absorbed and countered. When Chris attempted a vertical cut, the creature countered not by blocking, but by instantly retracting its limb, only to strike at the opposite, exposed ankle. It was trying to destabilize, not destroy. It was attempting to disarm. In one devastating exchange, the leader struck not at Chris's torso, but at the wrist holding the knife, using a sudden, high-velocity side hook designed to shatter the carpal bones and take away the human's primary tool. Chris absorbed the blow with his reinforced arm, the resulting sting traveling up his shoulder like electric fire, but the knife remained locked in his grip. He knew he could not win through superior strength. The creature's adaptability was too fast. If the fight lasted another 30 seconds, the leader would have sufficient data to predict his every move and render him ineffective. He had to end it now, with a decision that defied rational biology. Chris made an immediate, agonizing choice. He had to offer the creature the illusion of a perfect opening, leveraging its acquired knowledge against it. He deliberately slowed his defensive rotation by a fraction of a second and exposed his right flank, the side that was already wounded, the area where his body had already spent critical energy and was still bleeding beneath the hardened skin. He offered the leader a visible, compromised weakness. He feigned exhaustion, letting his shoulders slump just enough to suggest a momentary lapse in vigilance. The leader, interpreting this as the expected failure of the human form under duress, took the bait. It accelerated into the opening with predictable, overwhelming force, seeking to exploit the known wound and neutralize the combatant. This predictable trajectory was exactly what Chris needed. As the leader committed its full mass and energy into the strike, Chris dropped his center of gravity, ignoring the pain that flared white-hot in his flank. He allowed the leader to make contact, using the pressure of the attack to pivot. He forced the larger creature into a narrow passage formed by two supporting columns of basalt, where its massive, flexible body could not utilize its speed and maneuverability. He used his transformed elbow as a static lever, pinning the leader against the rock face in the narrow slot. This was a brutal, non-kinetic application of overwhelming structural force. He pressed, driving the leader's dense, heavily muscled body into the unyielding stone, eliminating the creature's ability to shift, recoil, or learn. The leader's path ended instantly in the crushing pressure of the confined space. The immediate aftermath was total, absolute structural failure. The leader was neutralized by the relentless application of compressive geometry, its thick, cartilaginous structure incapable of withstanding the force exerted in the confined passage. The pure animal satisfaction of the destruction surged through Chris, but the human portion of his mind immediately reasserted control, logging the data. Maximum force applied, structural integrity breached, core threat eliminated. The air in the chamber, still hot and oppressive, suddenly felt different. The suffocating chemical odor began to thin, weakening perceptibly as the primary biological engine shut down. The hundreds of small, rhythmic clicks from the young ceased instantaneously. The vacuum of silence returned, but this time it was heavy with finality. Chris spent a rapid 15 minutes securing the primary chamber, ensuring the destruction of the remaining incubation niches and any viable biological material. He retrieved the specialized propellant block, now unnecessary, and then began his exit. He moved quickly through the slick tunnels, the residual heat of the constructs fading behind him. He pushed back through the polished exit and stumbled into the outside world. The transition was jarring. The outside light, filtered though the dense canopy, seemed blindingly bright, almost painfully sharp. The sounds of the forest, the faint rustle of leaves, the drip of condensed moisture, the distant buzz of insects, were now deafeningly loud after the profound acoustic vacuum of the nest. He moved rapidly to the ridgeline, retrieving his cached gear. He conducted a quick perimeter check. No incoming signals, no thermal spikes, no runner patrols returned to aid the center. The structure had been fully autonomous, relying on strict separation from the wider network. Chris did not take the easy path back. He moved high, traversing the sharp, exposed ridges to put maximum distance between himself and the destroyed lair in the shortest possible time. The internal animal, satisfied by the violent success, began its slow, painful retreat, leaving behind a body that was intensely fatigued and throbbing with the accumulated trauma. He stopped only when he reached the highest, most exposed vista, a jagged peak looking out over the immense undulating canopy of the forest, which stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles toward the distant mountain range. He stood there, the cool, clean air finally displacing the stench of the nest in his lungs. The immediate mission, the elimination of this specific node, was complete. But as he looked out across the seemingly endless green, his senses, still hyperacute from the transformation, registered something more profound. He did not see an untouched wilderness. He saw a canvas filled with data, faint, subtle thermal signatures, chemical trails carried by the high-altitude air currents, too weak to detect before but undeniable now. He located them mentally, sparse, distant, separated by vast stretches of pristine territory. One signature radiated from the southwest, perhaps 50 miles out. Another, fainter, pulsed in the high, cold plateau to the north. This was not a solitary infestation. This was not a rogue colony or a one-off biological experiment gone wrong. What he had neutralized was a single active node in a highly distributed, systematically spread network. The structure was designed for compartmentalization, so the destruction of one cell would not compromise the whole. Chris shifted the weight of his pack, settling the straps tight against his aching shoulders. He did not look back at the fault line hidden in the distance. He looked forward, toward the horizon where the distant faint heat signatures pulsed in the pristine environment. He began his rapid descent, moving out of the exclusion zone and back toward the rendezvous point. He was wounded, exhausted, but alive, possessing new critical intelligence. The mission had been completed, but the true scope of the conflict had only just revealed itself. This was the opening salvo. The war had begun.